Beginning this video, I have to thank Mr. Pink personally for providing me with an early copy of Chambers. And I must tell you all that if you will enjoy this video and this game has any semblance of appeal to you, I beg you to buy it. The developer is currently struggling financially and would really appreciate the support from anybody of my viewers who are willing to contribute to it. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's begin. Chambers is a very complicated game to describe, at least to sell to someone directly. It's a recently released first-person shooter with RPG mechanics at its core, that includes a ton of mechanics from the movement shooter genre. Allows the players to tech and move extremely fast, and also boasts that it is punk AF. Things which it all does perfectly. In case you aren't aware, it's a video game developed by Mr. Pink's dev team of Golden Light fame, a game I've previously done a video on talking about its lore and my interpretation of it right on this channel. And ironically enough, what drew me into Golden Light was the floaty controls and surreal atmosphere, which puts a lot of people off that game. Chambers self-brands as RevolverPunk, a term that immediately signals a fusion of two subcultural lineages and also represents one of the weapons in the game. The Cowpunk tradition is what I'd first outline as the definitive representation of Chambers. Cowpunk first emerged in the late 1970s as a hybrid of country/cowboy imagery and punk's sort of rawness and destruction of conventions. It came to be through a variety of bands who wore western shirts, boots, and often incorporated high-tempo punk covers of country songs, or vice versa, precisely to reject mainstream aesthetics and celebrate a self-conscious DIY ethos. They were weirdos, but extremely lovable and interesting weirdos. Weirdos like me and you who find these types of things interesting. So you know, cowboy aesthetics were mixed with punk's core virtues of irreverence, nihilism, and amateurism. The sort of rough and ready lyrics or dialogue that mocks authority, and productions that often lean into that anything goes spirit. It's a mostly free genre, but it's also the result of a cultural movement. Chambers is a dream game for Mr. Pink, and that can be seen as early as its Steam description, where it describes itself as the aforementioned RevolverPunk. And through that, the game inherits Cowpunk's cowboy/punk marriage and doubles down on punk's in-your-face attitude. It treats the Wild West not as a romanticized myth-making, it treats it like a dirty, chaotic playground where the weapons you use, the horsing around you do, and self-survival coalescence into a raw, irreverent mess that's very well balanced around the story's themes and gameplay throughout. In that way, it reminds me a lot of Suda51's aerial style to games like Killer 7 or Flower, Sun and Rain. In that, despite the fact the game is paired with a very rough gameplay system, it ends up being fun and paired with an entirely batshit insane story scenario. We could go more in depth and to say the visuals itself contribute to the punk truth of it, you know, since most developers go towards the sort of PS1 aesthetics because of budget limitations, but in this case it also mirrors punk's amateur first aesthetic. It's identified directly as homemade or lo-fi, and that's a badge of authenticity for the game. It's not ugly, it's unique looking. Every jagged edge or weird texture is deliberately made to defy the look of the standard video game in some regard, in that sense. This game is sort of in the same vein, and thematically it follows quite a similar route, at least on paper. The main story follows an outlaw who appears to have no name. At the beginning of the game, we awaken in front of a coffin with a woman inside it. Our character says, "She is weak, gotta bring more flowers." Now, if you know anything about Mr. Pink, this scene is already throwing big, bright, PTSD-inducing lights, because I feel like it is indeed a word-for-word copy of the opening of Golden Light, even down to the details of the flower being a rose. I'm not sure the woman's name is Rose as well this time, but I really don't think it matters. We head out in order to get more roses for our beloved. But when heading back, bizarre flying guns, think UFO meets 6-shooter, swoop in and abduct her. Imagine something out of your worst nightmares, and that's what appears and snatches her away. We attempt to run back however fast we can, only to be cut off by bandits, prompting your first tutorial. Right away you learn to roll in any direction, and aiming feels loose enough to call to mind the Wii remote's waggle in games like Red Steel 2. Yet it's surprisingly intuitive. I can't recall another FPS in recent memory where every headshot, every dodge feels this intuitive and built so well for its systems. We push forwards in the hopes of rescuing her, but no matter our efforts and how many bandits we have to kill, she gets caught. At this point we decide to follow through to get back the casket. Our character says something quite funny when we arrive at the place. They took her away. Again. I can't really tell if this is supposed to be some sort of meta joke related to Golden Light or just the fact she was taken away in the past, but regardless of that, we give chase after the caravan of thieves. After a brief loading screen, we find ourselves on a ridge, overlooking a church fortress. Rumor has it that a fire-breathing demon is holed up inside, picking off stragglers from afar. Right here, Chambers throws its first proper tutorial towards you. Here, the player can learn a variety of things, one of my favorites being the fact that in typical cowboy fashion, you have to look down at your holster to switch weapons. Like any self-respecting cowboy, you glance down to your hip to draw your revolver. Right-clicking lets you slot a second gun into your offhand. Flipping weapons mid-combat feels rewarding, especially when you catch a glimpse of that revolving chamber animation every time you switch, or when you manage to align two guns just right for a double headshot. Another mechanic revolves around the act of squinting. By holding right-click with just one weapon equipped, every entity on the map gets highlighted, enemies in red and friendlies in blue halos, against the dusty backdrop. It's clever because it forces you to actively scan the environment rather than relying on an always-on outline. In this tutorial area, we also learn how to use cover, hide in barrels, grapple around using a lasso we keep in our hat. You can very easily press the grapple button and your character will chuck a lasso from the hat. Holding the grapple button lets you swing onto ledges or yank objects in your favor. Meanwhile, hiding behind barrels or kicking foes in the face teaches you how to manage cover and stagger enemies. Beneath it all, the shooting feels wonderfully pliant and responsive, although a bit floaty, yet precise enough that every landed shot gives a genuine sense of accomplishment, something very appropriate for a Mr. Pink game. The menus also feature the recurring motif of the revolver. Whenever you hit the inventory button, the menu spins in an animation that appears to be like a revolver's chambers. Here you get the ability to heal through eating. Check your backpack, summon your horse, among other things. That revolving chamber animation doesn't just act like eye candy in this case, but it also helps tie your equipment directly to the gunplay ethos. Every time you open the menu, you're reminded this world runs on 6-shooters and quick draws. We push forward, getting acquainted with the combat system, picking off people, looting, shooting and dodge rolling, and eventually make our way to the church. From below, it resembles a crucifix, a white marble cross topped with a revolver part pentagram in the center. An enormous barrel protrudes like an eye, periodically firing blue-tinged projectiles that glow against the twilight sky. An unsettling contrast to the dusty sepia-toned world around it. It's bluish and sort of ethereal and clearly sets the tone for what I was about to see inside. When we finally arrive inside, the Pope, a guy in a white suit, appears to be mechanized like those UFOs we've seen earlier. His arms are revolver cylinders, his body is of metal, only his upper torso remains human. The room is filled strangely with cowheads, or so it appears. He addresses us directly. He states we aren't either of the blue or red faction and explains he is quite confused but says something of detail. He realizes we were the person hiding the rose coffin in our shack and says that times have changed and his faction needs the coffin to use it for greater good, saying that it will help them take back these lands. He gives us a chance to walk away, but we refuse, so he ends up knocking us out and burying us alive. Traditional westerns often valorize law versus outlaw in black and white morality, but here things are brought in a more nuanced manner, as we're unsure which faction is truly in the right. The outlaw's motives are never pure. Is it truly rescue your lover, maybe loot and shoot? Absolutely, there's a cynical undercurrent. They took her away again, delivered with a deadpan irony, almost treating the violent abduction as a meaningless cycle, like, oh, it happened yet again. That nihilistic refrain reflects Punk's mockery of grand narratives, because nowhere does this try to subvert you or preach in any regard. A lot of the game's sensibilities are built on satire. For example, the Pope's design and even the room we find him in is a very grand ritualistic parody of religious powers present in the real world, the Vatican and whatnot. He wears the classic ecclesial robes over a twisted biomechanical exoskeleton, and his arms are revolvers wielded into the flesh, with chambers that spin as he attacks. He's a literal manifestation of Chambers' entire artistic and aesthetic forefront. After the Pope buries me, I find myself in a cramped coffin underground. My outlaw mutters, they'll need her alive if they're going to use the coffin. With a guttural kick, I burst through the lid. I'm now in a graveyard, descending downhill. I meet a stranger who is mad. We're still alive. We're taught that we can catch a bullet in midair and throw them back at enemies. We kill him, and after surviving the encounter, we sprint towards a nearby town. Here we can meet the doctor, which gives us our first accessory, a gun, and teaches us that we can cook in order to restore our health, by doing so at campfires. It's a simple system: drop raw venison or vegetables on the fire, press a button, eat to refill health. But it underlines the game's survival meets punk philosophy. Fight hard, eat hard. Exiting town, I run headlong into the Black Rose faction's guard post, situated at the exit. They seem to be guarding a circular arena carved into the cliffside. 30 seconds later, I'm neck deep in gunfire, dodging between cover points as wave after wave of bandits descend. The tactics are predictable as usual per first arena of the game. After fighting our way through the bandits, the last one walks us over to their leader. The leader asks us to put him down if we want a lead, and soon enough we engage in a classic cowboy duel. First to draw and shoot wins. Killing him, we notice he had a tattoo of a map on his ankle, so we copy that over and now get a proper objective. Before we can venture out into the open world, however, we find a baby inside a small church the leader was guarding. We decide to take it with us and take care of it. Above the place it laid before is a sign reading, "Shadow beyond the horizon," not the one that fades, but the one that waits for a return. It's unclear if there's a prophecy, a warning, or the ramblings of the dying Pope-like leader, but the implication is clear. This child is tied to something beyond our character. A curse, maybe a promise. We choose to take it. The game doesn't give you a yes or no, you just do. From this moment, the baby becomes a permanent companion, a fragile presence in your inventory UI or swaddled in your saddlebag that you need to constantly feed, otherwise it eats away at inventory items. As we leave the church, one person also hands us a whistle with our own personal horse. From here on out, the game opens up. You can either follow along the main quest or meet up with a variety of characters in order to pursue different kinds of side quests. But rather than charting every narrative branch or mechanical nuance, I want to take a step back because I'm a sort of different kind of person, and to me, while the game is extremely fun and appealing in this regard, I think its style and aesthetics along with the music and overall presentation appeal more to me. Mostly, I want to focus on what makes this specific video game punk, and what really defines a punk video game. And not just punk in the musical sense, but punk as a cultural force, an undercurrent or defiance, grime and grotesque individualism that courses through its veins. But you know, as all things that come and go, certain genres or cultural movements never really stay the exact same. They sort of turn into weird twists of the same thing that become so far apart that you begin questioning whether they are the same bloody thing at times. For example, punk doesn't always stay punk. Sometimes it mutates, it turns inward, falls over itself and starts to interrogate its own theatrics, and that's where its younger, more polite brother post-punk lives, across the street in a nicer residential area. I've spoken a bit earlier about the aesthetics and sort of scope of Cowpunk trappings, which don't really properly convey the entire runtime of Chambers. I really don't think that Chambers fits into this cowpunk aesthetic that much. It's just the cowboy part which drags it closer to it, and a sort of resemblance to it. There's something deeper going on here, a kind of post-punk energy that reminds me less of spaghetti westerns and more of the video games that sit in that weird nervous space between punk's explosion and its commodification. So what is it then? Is it punk? Is it post-punk? I think back a lot of times to Suda51's Killer 7, a game I plan to do a video on one day. A game that to me is a masterpiece that exists in this space, not just breaking rules, but actively forgetting that they ever existed. Killer 7 is the sort of thing people casually dismiss as random if they're not paying attention. But if you've ever sat with it, really sat with it, you start to see the shape inside the noise, and the game's story starts to make more sense than ever. It's a game that plays like a rail shooter in one breath and an abstract puzzle game in the next. It leaps between animation styles as if it's changing emotional registers. You shoot invisible monsters with grins carved into their faces called smiles, navigate sterile government office, blow open secret passages by triggering obtuse rituals, all the while the story unfolds in clean episodic bursts like a demented television series that takes place in an alternate reality where all government officials take decisions by taking crack right before clocking in. And despite all that apparent chaos, there's cohesion. Themes loop back in on themselves, characters that die reappear, contradict themselves, and still somehow feel consistent. I've played it over and over again. I've read the supplementary lore, hand in Killer 7. I barely feel like I properly understand the entire thing, but I feel it. I feel the weight of the assassin's fate in the late game gauntlet, not because I fully grasped their backstory. Those, we learn, were left uncompleted due to a budget too small to fit the game's scope. It's because they were one of the few constants in the game's hurricane of shifting logic which anchored the player, and it's this sort of sensibility that's what post-punk in games feels like to me. That's what a post-punk game is. It isn't rebellion for the sake of it, but dissonance, distortion, a sense of unease and emotional weight even in the absence of a traditional narrative clarity. And Chambers, in its own dusty, scorched earth way, captures that same feeling. It's not like Killer 7, not in its mechanics or structure, but in its vibe, the mood that forms when a game commits so hard to a certain aesthetic, that ideological thought line, that even its brokenness becomes part of the message. The jank gets integrated into how batshit insane the developers' ideas were. The deliberately obscure NPC dialogue, the awkward mechanics, the strange and untraceable rules that govern some of the world's interactions, they feel less so like design oversights and more like aesthetic language of post-punk confusion, where disorientation is entirely the point. When you walk out of that town and into the dust-choked wilds, Chambers reveals its true face. A decaying frontier littered with towering, half-buried, revolver-shaped machines, totems of violence, symbols of entropy masquerading as industry, like monuments erected by a culture that worshipped firepower and then died off screaming. They give the world an almost spiritual charge, the way rusted gods might in a post-collapse theology. Their presence evokes a mood closer to a heavy metal album covers than western movie sets. It's a punk move, not because it's loud or abrasive, but because it refuses to romanticize the Old West, where traditional cowboy media sanitizes the frontier into a myth of manifest destiny and ragged self-reliance. Chambers tears it down and spits it back up. This is outlaw country in its most literal sense. The feeling of being beyond the border of the familiar, rejected by civilization and rejecting it right back. You feel it in the silence between gunshots, in the crumbling buildings and haunted churches, and in the company of freaks, loners and half-mechanical prophets you meet on the road. The spirit of the game is closer to Townes Van Zandt's kind of country music for drifters, burnouts, men talking to ghosts, and whiskey bottles than to anything you'd hear in a mainstream western soundtrack. This isn't exactly about the soundtrack either, way more like the feeling of the game's existence. Although the game's soundtrack leans towards something akin to Golden Lights 1, with dissonant cascades of sounds and crackly vocals, but it does include more western themed songs as well. This kind of unshaven, half wild texture that comes not from genre tropes but from the emotional exhaustion the medium pushes forward. So let's take a look at some songs. Chambers doesn't borrow outlaw aesthetics for set dressing, it builds the entire game structure around its embodiment of rough-hand fatalism. There's a melancholy baked into the world, but it's not the melancholy of lost love or fading glory. It's the punk version, the numb bake of a world built on lies, still running on fumes, where you keep moving because what else is there to do? The machines are broken, but they're still turning. You get the sense that the revolver monuments aren't just remnants of war, the reminders that the fight never meant anything. It's like staring down the barrel of a past that refused to die, so now it lives on as rust and noise. You know, this feeling's a bit off, because even though we've defined what a post-punk video game is, I don't entirely feel like Chambers is entirely post-punk. It's there, it has all of the characteristics of a post-punk video game, but let me check. Oh yeah, it claims to be its own genre, as I said earlier, RevolverPunk. Mr. Pink half-jokingly brands Chambers as being RevolverPunk. So what in the bloody heck is a RevolverPunk video game? I ask myself right now because I think if we stood here together and thought about it, we'd eventually come up with an answer. But the more I sit with it, the more I think it's worth taking seriously as a concept. Like, not just mentioning it in passing and being like, oh, it's because it has big revolvers and it has post-punk sensibilities. No, that would be not only the boring answer, but just not satisfying to me. So let's start a train of thought. Let's assume that it is not just as a fun label slapped onto a lo-fi shooter with western imagery, but a genuine micro-genre, an undercurrent too weird to market but too vivid to ignore. Okay, then how would we define RevolverPunk? If RevolverPunk doesn't necessarily mean just revolvers or punks with guns, well, by taking the only game as of now that we know to be in this made-up genre and looking at every single characteristic of it. Based on that, I can confidently say that it's about a very specific convergence. The aesthetics of decay, both bodily and moral, the sense of being out of time and out of place, and a desperation to make something meaningful from the fragments. It owes more to the outlaw myth twisted through VHS static than to any real historical frontiers. Think about the way Chambers presents its world, full of machines that look like they were dreamed by someone who's only heard descriptions of guns, second-hand. Everything feels like it's trying to be a replica of something older, perhaps something purer that no longer exists, like an all-powerful god. It's a setting where meaning is always slightly degraded. It bases itself on stuff like the good, the bad and the ugly. Thing we can see even from the main character's sort of clothing, but it ends up being not a mockery, a parody of the Wild West, like a mimeograph of a mimeograph. And yet, it all hits harder because of that, because of how clearly it knows it's deteriorating. That sense of breakdown its stitched world gives off. A world stitched together from corpses of genre and historical monuments feels powerful, yet it bleeds directly into its gameplay. Chambers plays like something that was only half finished, on purpose. Well, a bit on purpose. While the game is definitely still in early access, a lot of that jank is part of the director's view. In that sense, it ends up feeling like a machine assembled out of older machines, with parts that don't quite fit anymore, but still move when you hit the right button. The gunplay is loose, deliberately awkward, as if firing is never supposed to feel like power but like necessity, like a stuttering survival instinct. If post-punk was about making music with whatever broken instruments you had left after punk exploded, then RevolverPunk is what happens when the same approach is applied to a genre of fiction and interaction design. It's not western and it's not punk, it's the residue of both, shot through with rot and loneliness. This feeling of a game straining against its own limits, sometimes collapsing under the weight of its own atmosphere, isn't entirely unique to Chambers, but it is unusually committed. Other games dabble in decay, try on a broken mask, but Chambers wears it like a second skin. You see traces of this same impulse in things like the games we've covered on this channel before, Fuse to 40 and Sanctuary, but also things like Cruelty Squad, which all share the same sickly refusal to be clean, legible or palatable. But none of them are RevolverPunk. It feels like it's Rabid Cousin, a bio-corporate nightmare where the UI itself is hostile and the world operates according to the rules that seem half-coded, half-hallucinated, the same sort of presence. I guess then the motive of the revolver plays heavily into RevolverPunk. Let's take a different approach. What about Mr. Pink's previous game, Golden Light? There's the same desperation to claw meaning from refuse to weaponize the grotesque in a way that feels truer than anything polished, with its procedural, mid-corridors, roguelike mechanics and dissonant slapdash soundscape. It feels very hostile towards the player. So much so that instead of actively engaging with the enemies, you struggle to survive them, flinching through its crumbling spaces like you've woken up inside a broken mod for a game that never existed. These sort of games don't chase confusion for their own sake. They aren't just being weird to get attention, they do it for a deliberate gameplay purpose, or to instill a certain feeling. What they do is offer a different kind of engagement, one that isn't about control or clarity, but about immersion into brokenness. They hand you fragments and trust you to feel your way through them, instead of guiding you by hand. They leave traces and expect you to follow the trail with your own instincts. But if RevolverPunk is real, as in it's a real genre, if we take seriously Mr. Pink's accidental manifesto, then these games are its satellite states. His games are defined by the revolver. Golden Light would probably then pre-RevolverPunk, and other games featuring this motif from now on of mechanized punk-inspired existences would be RevolverPunk. They orbit a shared sensibility, lo-fi apocalypse, dying systems, protagonists with a weapon and a vague sense of obligation to move forward, not to triumph, but because there's no rewind button, I guess. They're not retro, they're post-everything. Post-genre, post-market, post-narrative cohesion, they're held together with tape, spit, and commitment. So, what would be a pre-RevolverPunk type of media that encapsulates elements of it? Well, we have quite a few. Oh boy. Golden Light, that's proto-RevolverPunk, pre-Contact. Everything after it, these glitchy gun cord dying system games, they're inheriting something. Mechanized punk-inspired existence, lo-fi apocalypses, a protagonist with a weapon and a vague obligation to move forward, not to win, but because stopping isn't even an option, as I've said before. I guess stuff like Gungrave, where the main protagonist has the giant coffin gun on his back and a lot of the enemies both in the anime, manga and game use random objects that sort of shoot bullets. There's a big focus on the gun aspect of it. I'd say that's certified RevolverPunk, since it's also quite punk. I think a lot of enemies found within the video game Metal Slug also fall in that category. While the game isn't entirely punk, it certainly has the living gun motif. It's a bit more Saturday morning military, but the enemy designs, living guns, walking cannons, I'd rate it a pistol out of 5 revolvers on the RevolverPunk scale. I was thinking the Gun Devil in Chainsaw Man, yeah, that shit is insanely RevolverPunk. Weapon-ass cosmic horror, systemic violence with bullets for teeth. And that's about all that I can think for now. But let me know if you have any other ideas to any other things which could be considered RevolverPunk. One thing I want to do, however, is give RevolverPunk a proper definition. So let's do that. RevolverPunk is a subgenre of aesthetic style derived from punk culture and media that blends traditional punk elements with imagery and themes centered around revolvers, handguns, often with the intention of evoking a gritty, raw, and rebellious atmosphere, as in typical punk fashion. It usually incorporates motifs of old-fashioned firearms, outlaw, or Wild West vibes, and a tough no-nonsense attitude that fuses punk's DIY ethos with a rough, sometimes retro weaponized symbolism. RevolverPunk may also overlap with Cowpunk or punk-inspired Western subcultures, emphasizing rugged individualism, anti-establishment rebellion, and a blend of punk music or fashion with gun-related iconography. Examples of RevolverPunk media include Chambers, Gungrave, and even certain elements within series like the Gun Devil in Chainsaw Man. So, load the cylinder, spin it. This is the Wild West. There's no going back to the ways that came before punk. This is RevolverPunk.